This lecture will introduce you into our first unit in English 102 on understanding genre, and we'll be talking a little bit about genre and rhetoric and narrative in this part of the lecture. Before we can begin to discuss and practice with genres, we need to first define what genre is and get some basic understanding of that. And I just want to say, for some of you, this might be a review of the material from English 101. But even if that's the case, don't just skip this lecture after seeing the first part, because there are some things within the lecture that I'll make connections to within our study of English 102. So I don't want you to miss anything thinking, oh, I've heard about this before. Make sure you pay attention. And this lecture is really important because it's going to set the foundation for the course as we go forward through the semester. We'll be using some of these same terms throughout the semester. So, first and foremost, what is genre? Just simply to define genre, it just means a kind or a category or a sort. Some examples of genres that you might already know about, think about music, how that can be divided into genres like country or rap or R&B. Think about different types of literature where you have different types of fiction, which could be short stories or novels. Another example might be restaurants. You know, if you look on Yelp for restaurant reviews, they're going to have them split into genres of different types of cuisine. It might be like Italian or Mexican or American. And then they can also be subdivided even further into types of that genre. It could be an Italian restaurant, but it could be fast food or it could be sit down. So there can also be subgenres of genres. So here's what you need to know about genres. Two things. First, genres change according to the ways people use them. Going back to that restaurant example I was just giving you about looking at restaurants on Yelp. If you're looking for a cuisine, a specific type of cuisine, you might look at the genre of the type of cuisine. Whereas if you're looking for a specific type of restaurant, say you want to get fast food, you don't really care what the cuisine is, you'd pick, even though it's the same topic of food, the genre would change, okay? Genres can also be flexible. They might be a combination of things, like I was just talking about with the restaurants or with music, for instance. Sometimes, you could be a gospel singer, but then pair up with an R&B person and do a collaboration, and that could be a different combination of genres. So, one thing I want you to think about is think about what you already know about genres. What are the things that you already know about genre? And brainstorm on your own some types of genres other than the examples that I gave you as you're reading and studying so that you can understand genre a little bit better. So, a big point and a big part of understanding different genres and understanding fiction and nonfiction and any type of communication for that matter is understanding the rhetorical situation. And what that means is being able to understand the relationship between the audience, the text, and the author. And in this class, we're going to use text loosely. Sure, we're going to look at some traditional texts, some short stories, poems, a play, traditional literary texts, but we're also going to look at some non-traditional texts like digital stories, podcasts, graphic novels. We're going to look at all the different types of text that there are. And in order to understand those types of text, you have to be able to understand the rhetoric that's being used in those texts. And so when we define rhetoric, what I say when I'm meaning rhetoric, a fancy definition taken from Christina Alfano's In Vision and Depth is the ability to discern the tools of persuasion used to create an argument. So what does that mean in layman's terms? Simply put, what that means is when you hear or read or experience something, you're able to understand how the person that created that use different tools to convince you of an overall purpose. Okay? Usually, when I ask students to tell me what they think rhetoric is, the first thing that they'll say is rhetorical question. And when I ask what that is, they'll say, oh, well, that's just a question you ask when you already know the answer to. And I'm like, well, why do you do that? And at first, they're like, I don't know why I do that. But then they'll start to think about it. Oh, well, you do that for emphasis to prove a point. So just by using a rhetorical question, you're using one of those tools to create a emphasis on a point. Sometimes students will associate the word rhetoric with politics, and they really are not. When politicians or news talking heads use that word, the governor's speech was full of rhetoric, or the president's speech was full of rhetoric. They're not using the word correctly. They're actually just like using that instead of using the word BS. So that's not really what rhetoric is. Rhetoric is actually being able to understand how an argument is being created. It's not actually the argument itself. And we'll talk in a minute about some of the things that are the elements that perhaps these newscasters or journalists could use as words instead of misusing the word rhetoric. So another thing that you need to know to understand a rhetorical situation is to be able to understand the context of what you're reading, what you're hearing, what you're seeing. Context is key here, okay? A quick definition of context, in case you don't know what that means. Context is simply, Google says it's the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea in terms of which can be fully understood and assessed. The parts of something written or spoken that immediately precede and follow a word or passage and clarify its meaning. So context, to put in regular terminology, is all of the things that surround an idea, okay? And this is something that does happen in the media or, online all the time, is little blurbs and pieces of a conversation are taken out of something that somebody says without the rest of the sentence around it. So there isn't any context, and so people can often look misquoted or, hey, I didn't really say that. You didn't understand that I was talking to this specific audience. And so I'm sure you've seen some celebrities have some snafus with that in the news and other people. So that's, and then once you go and research and know the context, then you're like, oh, that actually wasn't what the headline said. So understanding context is really important to be able to discern, again, the types of persuasion that an author is using to convince you of something. Okay? So I'm going to repeat myself again. The rhetorical situation is the relationship between the audience, text, and author. And a great way to understand this is by looking at what's called the rhetorical triangle. The rhetorical triangle, it illustrates, let me back out here so you can see the little triangle a bit better. Then zoom in, sorry. Not trying to make you motion sick. Okay, the rhetorical situation, the rhetorical triangle illustrates that rhetorical situation really well, because then you can kind of get a visual of it if you're a more visual person. So it's how the author relates to the text, relates to the audience, and how the audience relates to the author, and how the audience relates to the text. All of these things intersect, with context being in the middle and all around these things, okay? So what does that mean? Just to review over. When you're understanding the rhetorical situation or the relationship between the audience, text, and author, you're going to be able to more fully understand what you're reading and or more fully understand what you're writing about. So if, for instance, if an author, say, is a let's think. If the author is a Bud Light commercial, okay, it's a beer commercial. And so the marketing firm wrote the beer commercial, okay, and the text is the beer commercial. Who is the typical audience for that? 21 to 35 for Bud Light, you know, probably male, not to stereotype too much. Um, Female too, but mostly that's who they're marketing to is males. The author, the marketing company, has to understand this audience in order to create a text or a commercial that would appeal to this audience. And so they have to build this context around these things in order to create a strong argument. If they created a Bud Light commercial with ballerinas and their audience was 21 to 35-year-old males and it wasn't funny, it was just a very serious dance commercial, and again, I'm being stereotypical here, then would their argument be very effective? No, because they're not considering their audience when they're creating the text. So in order to create an effective text, that author has to consider the audience. Now, if the audience already has a relationship with the author, sometimes the author can change the text in a different way where the audience might not previously had understood the text, but because it has that certain author, now they're interested in it. Okay, so it can work a bunch of different ways. So the rhetorical situation is understanding the relationship between audience, text, and author. Okay, so in addition to the rhetorical situation, which I will mention constantly as we are doing our studies this semester, you will also hear me constantly reminding you of audience and purpose. I'll be saying, consider your audience. Who is your audience? Who is the audience in this piece? Who did the author intend this for? What is the purpose? What is the author trying to what are they trying to achieve? So these are things that are going to be super important to concepts to grasp for the semester. And we'll have lots of practice with them. If you're having trouble with the rhetoric and audience and purpose at the first part, you're going to get lots of practice to hopefully at the end, since this is English 102, you will have audience and purpose and rhetorical context down completely so that when you get into your upper level classes that will require some more strenuous writing, you will be doing fabulously. And not just writing, critical thinking as well. And we'll talk about that in a second. Pardon me. So purpose. When you're reading something or when you're writing something, you have to think of the why. Why are you composing it? What is your purpose? What are you trying to achieve when you're composing it? What's the rhetorical situation? Who's your audience? What's the text going to be like? Once you know those things, you can plan and pick the proper genre to get your purpose across, okay? And then your audience is who you're composing for. How do you know who it is for? You know, what are the clues that you look for in order to know who your audience is? And when you're considering that, one way to do that is to be specific. You can't really make good genre choices if you don't specifically know who your audience is. So it's really bad if you say, well, this is just for a general audience. I do not know who a general audience is. That does not really mean anything. Do you mean a general audience of people in China? That doesn't really mean anything. That doesn't help you make decisions. So you really need to know your specific audience. You know, if you're calling in to work because you're sick, who's your audience? It's not a general audience. It's an audience of your direct supervisor that you need to contact about your attendance, okay? So when you're considering your audience, be sure to be specific. So bad general audience. A good example would be audience of American community college students, okay? While there are several subgenres within that genre that you could hone in on, that's still being more specific, okay? So again, audience and purpose. Super, super important. So one way in which rhetoric is used is by, I told you before how politicians or journalists, talking heads will often say the rhetoric in this speech is very inflammatory. Actually, what they're talking about are the rhetorical appeals, those tools that are being used to convince an audience of something. When we persuade an audience, we're using rhetorical appeals. And rhetorical appeals are elements in a piece of persuasion that work together to convince an audience of an overall purpose. So they're the tools in your toolkit that you can use to convince a specific audience of your purpose. Different ways of using the appeals depends on how you understand your audience and purpose. So the first tool in your tool bag of convincing people of stuff is ethos. Credibility, authority, and trustworthiness. That's the definition of ethos. So when we talk about ethos, we're talking about an appeal to the audience's senses of credibility, authority, and trustworthiness. Okay? So here are some examples of ethos, but one thing to keep in mind is to remember that it's going to be influenced directly by the audience, okay? If you're talking about an authority figure or you're talking about someone that has a strong voice, then whoever that audience is going to depend on whether they find the ethos to be valid or not. For instance, your textbook. If I tell you that your textbook author, I'm going to look it up now because I know who our author is, Brazeller and Kleinfeld, but I'm going to look here in the About Me section, the preface of our text, and I'm going to, it'll take me a second to find it, so I'll kind of talk under my mouth while I do that. Talk under my breath. Oh, sorry. You hear my dog whining about me flipping pages. She's trying to take a nap, and I'm just bothering her by creating this. When you look at our textbook and you read the preface that the authors of the textbook who have written the textbook, they tell you who they are and why they have the ethos or the authority to write your textbook. You know, our author is from, and I had it right on the page and then I lost it. Sorry. Our author, when you look in there, you know, she is from, well, shoot, where did it go? Wait a second. Acknowledgements, blah, blah, blah. Come on, guys. This was supposed to be the most wonderful example of all time until I just sounded silly by not knowing who they were. Aha! Okay, our author, it comes from Washington State University. So, knowing that, we know that they are from Washington State University, which has a very prestigious English department. And so we know that that is where their authority comes from to write a textbook. If we saw in their bio that they were just crazy Uncle Jerry from down the street, that might not appeal to our sense of ethos as students with a textbook. We want someone that has an expertise in that field to write the textbook. Just like when you take an English course or any course at Midlands Tech for that matter, you want to be sure that your professor has credentials to teach you. You know, if someone just showed up and started teaching you physics and didn't ever go to school for it, you'd not really trust their authority. You know, in commercials, their examples can be celebrity spokespeople. And again, that depends on the audience. If you talk about a Proactive pimple cream and Justin Bieber is the spokesperson for it, I mean, he's not an authority to me whatsoever. He would not influence me to buy something, but his fans, the millions of fans that he's going to be influential to them as an authority figure. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be like a doctor or a lawyer, though those are a teacher. Those can be authorities. It can also be celebrities dependent on the audience, okay? Another tool or example of a rhetorical appeal that you can use is called pathos or pathos. And this appeals to an audience's sense of emotion and or their moral values. So ways that authors can appeal to pathos can be through humor, can be through sadness, it can be through things like patriotism, it can be through inflammatory language to make you extremely angry. angry, and again, this is going to appeal to an audience, to depend on the audience. You know, have you ever seen those ASPCA commercials with a little sad little kitty cat in the cage and like one-eyed cat? It's like meow, and they're playing like that really sad music in the background, and you're like, oh my gosh, get me my wallet right away. Well, I am anyways. I am the target audience for that as an animal lover. I see that. I am simultaneously angry and sad, and I want to get motivated to get my wallet out to give those poor little puppies all my money, okay? Um, you know, my cousin, on the other hand, he likes animals, but he is not sentimental. He sees that and he's like, yeah, whatever. He doesn't really care. So it depends on the audience. But that tool of using those sad little one-eyed cats in the video is going to appeal to that particular audience's sense of emotion. Super Bowl commercials, those are funny for a reason. They get people talking about it and laughing about it and talking about it at halftime and talking about it the next day and analyzing what happened and, oh boy, wasn't that funny? Why? Probably to sell Doritos, right? But that humor is really effective. Patriotism, you know, that's part of your nationalism is part of identity in cultures. And so there's a reason why soda cans are red, white, and blue, and combinations of red and white and blue and white and red, because that is sending the audience the message, we are America's beverage. The same reason why political campaigns use red, white, and blue, because they're playing on that patriotic heartstring in order to convince audience of a purpose. And some of these things can be exaggerated, like I'm speaking about in these examples. And just keep in mind that some of these things can be more subtle. I mean, you might not really think about the red, white, and blue Coke, you know, the red and white Coke can, unless I point that out to you. But it can be subtly advertised in that way. Beer cans too tend to have those colors. Don't challenge me. I know there's exceptions to that, but when we talk about your old standards, there's a reason behind that. The final tool in the rhetorical appeals that can appeal, you can use to convince your audience of something, is the logos appeal. And that is appealing to your sense of logic and connections of facts and evidence. And so examples of that might include facts, statistics, charts, graphs, before and afters. You know, you see those in car commercials all the time. This car gets such and such miles per gallon. You know, when you read in a textbook and they give you a fact, they are convincing you, they are telling you the truth by showing you the fact, okay? And it can also be more, those are very specific things, but again, they can also be more subtle, such as a reasoned argument. If you do A, then B will happen. So sometimes it doesn't have to necessarily be a fact or a statistic, it can be a reasoned argument, okay? And again, your audience matters here, you know, and it also matters who, you know, that rhetorical situation of the author and the audience and the text, that all matters too, especially when we start talking about statistics. The author of those statistics, they're writing them in a way to convince that audience of a specific thing, and so they're going to write the statistics in a way that, while facts, yes, facts are facts, facts can be presented in specific ways to convince you of certain things, you know, in noble and nefarious ways. And so those are the tools, the rhetorical appeals or the rhetorical tools, ethos, pathos, and logos, that you can use to help understand or discern the means of persuasion that an author is using when they're trying to convince you of a specific purpose, or tools that you can use as an author when you're trying to get across a certain purpose to an audience. And this doesn't just have to be in a pro-con argumentative essay type of way. You can do this in nonfiction and in fiction genres as well. You know, when somebody wants to tell a fictional story about their history as a reader and a writer, they might want to make that important to their audience by establishing a trustworthy, by bringing them in with appeal to their emotion, and by giving them some kind of logic and facts so that they can follow the logic behind the purpose. One last thing I will leave you to is that these are the uses of appeals, but sometimes they can be misused for nefarious and noble reasons. And when that happens, that's called fallacy. And we'll talk about that later, because that does happen, and we'll talk about that later. But for now, this should just give you the basics to get started in understanding more about the composition process and the critical thinking and critical genre awareness process that is incredibly important for you to learn as a student in college. And a student in life, I might add. I hope that this has helped you to understand more about genre, and I hope that you have a